Yo ho ho and a jolly mast, Chris listeners. With me, Tom Crowley. Yes, can you believe it? Another year has come to an end, and then another year has begun and got halfway through, which can only mean one thing. Yes, it's time to celebrate Mast Chris, the summertime holiday with the totally tropical taste. The sun-soaked orgy of fruity cocktails, barbecued meats, emotionally brutal moral lessons, and laid-back beach anthems that all sound exactly the same as each other.
This Mast Chris night, hope I'll be alright, and my only scars will be emotional.
If you're listening to this and you're enjoying it, obviously, but you're also thinking to yourself, wow, I could not have less of an idea what this filthy idiot's talking about, then bloody hell, filthy idiot, you've got a pair of brass trousers on, haven't you? God, that makes me cross! And you may be living in one of the few nations in the world which don't celebrate Mast Chris, including Liechtenstein, the Maldives, San Marino, Laos, and China. You could also be living in one of the countries where it's known by a different name, like in Germany where it's called Nachtweiten, France where it's called Enol, or the Netherlands where it's called Blauballen Explosiedag. Or perhaps you've just lived a deprived life. But whatever the case, if you don't regularly observe this joyful, sweaty, sunburnt festival and you'd like to start, then I recommend rolling back your podcast app to the June 2022 episode of Crowley Time, where I provided a brief history of the holiday and its traditions in the episode entitled The True Meaning of Mast Chris.
The true meaning of Mast Chris.
Yes, that's the one. But there is one special day in Mast Chris Tide which I haven't yet covered on this show. One I wanted to explore in more detail, as most people don't know the full story behind it. Of course, we all know that the 24th of June is Mast Chris Eve, and that at midnight, going into Mast Chris Day on the 25th, Captain Mast Chris and his demon elf crew raid the homes of ill-mannered children across the globe to plunder back their ill-gotten Christmas presents and kill everyone. We also know that the following day, the 26th of June, is Fat Stephen's Rest, a day dedicated to lying down, moaning a lot, and sleeping off your feverish rum and pork-based stupor. But just who was Fat Stephen, and what necessitated this fabled and storied resting period? That's what we're going to find out as I read you the whole thrilling legend as handed down from generation to generation in the folkloric tradition and compiled and retold by me, Tom Crowley. The Legend of Fat Stephen.
The legend of Fat Stephen.
In all the skies throughout the world, behind every cloud, under every rainbow, atop every mountain, no airship was ever feared more than the Angry Maiden. At the merest glimpse of its flag, the skull and crossed forks, all airfarers, be they hot air balloonist, aeroplane pilot or hang gliderer, turn wing and flee like scared newborn chicks for the fear of the ship's crew of demon elves and, worst of all, their buccaneer king, the terror of the troposphere, the dreaded Captain Mast Chris. Yo-ho-ho! And why not? After all, was this not the band of creepy critters who, year after year, scoured every home in the world apart from those in Liechtenstein, the Maldives, San Marino, Laos and China, tearing gifts from the arms of misbehaving children, then tearing the arms from their families, and leaving novelty sugar skull sweets for the well-behaved ones? Yes, it was. And while their captain was undoubtedly the most feared of them all, so too do the naughty children of the world quake in terror at the thought of all his drooling, snarling, pointy-eared crew with their grasping clawed hands, glinting yellow fangs, stubby little horns, and dress sense that fails to elevate itself above the obvious limitations of tatty-found fabrics and third-generation hand-me-downs to something more composed and with a clearer intention, like an eclectic or shabby chic aesthetic. All except one, that is. For unlike his mischievous comrades, one of the demonic elves sought only simple pleasures and possessed something very unusual for one of his kind, a spark of kindness. Who was this miraculous creature? A mere deckhand, known as Fat Stephen. Perhaps predictably for someone of his moniker, Fat Stephen had quite the appetite, and sometimes it got him into trouble. For example, on the night of the Great Freeze, when the angry maiden was grounded on a particularly tall iceberg, Stephen succumbed to the pangs in his stomach and ate the walrus that was attempting to tow them to safety.
"Fat Stephen!" the captain had cried. "You're as dense as a January fog!"
And then he punched him in the kidneys. But despite his insatiable appetite and his black hole of a stomach, if there's one thing that Fat Stephen was not, it was greedy. Even at dinner time on a summer's day, after a full shift of scraping out the bilges, he would always be sure to save his last rissole to share with Runkles, the smallest of the elves. Unfortunately, Runkles, like the rest of his kind, didn't value or even really understand concepts like kindness and generosity, and every time Fat Stephen handed him a precious greasy globe, he would snatch it up and hiss,
"Snooze you lose, fatty!"
as he scampered off. This usually led to a tornado of laughter from the rest of the crew, who shouted hurtful things like,
"You're a sap, Fat Stephen!"
and
"He certainly showed you a lesson, you oily fool!"
and "If I were outmatched in such a fashion, I'd surely run myself through with my own steel as an example to others." Worst of all was Captain Mast Chris's first mate, Sputum, the most damnable of all the damned elves, who would cackle spittily through his one enormous tusk and shout,
"Nice one, you fat prick!"
After 9 or 20 years of such routine humiliations, Fat Stephen was starting to grow tired of life aboard the Angry Maiden. The occasional bit of teasing is all part of the rambunctious life of a privateer, most assuredly. But to be openly abused constantly in front of the only family you've ever known, well, it gets a little wearing after a while. As the crew raced around the ship preparing for the midnight raid that fateful Mast Chris Eve, Stephen's spirits were really starting to flag. "Maybe I could find something else to do," he pondered to himself. "I could look for a job behind the bar in a demon elf pub, or retrain as a demon elf hairdresser and stylist." But this dream of a gentler, kinder life was cut short by the paint-stripping rasp of the captain's voice.
"Fat Stephen, you rotten bollock!"
he cried across the deck. Fat Stephen tried to stand to attention and salute, but he had over-swabbed that part of the deck, and he slipped and toppled gracelessly into his own swab bucket, which was, and this cannot be overstressed, absolutely teeming with angry crabs.
"Cut out the gymnastics and hark ye!"
barked the captain as Stephen leapt around in pain, plucking furious crustaceans from his bottom.
"We're coming into Skyport at the top of Mount Finger Peak. Ye and Sputum are gonna go and stock up for the raid tonight."
Fat Stephen was shocked, but thrilled. He had never been allowed to go on a supply run to the markets before. "I thought you usually preferred to go yourself, Captain," said Fat Stephen after he'd eaten the last of the bucket crabs. "And last week you said you wouldn't trust me to run a finger-throwing contest in a leper colony."
"'Tis true," growled the captain. "But all the other elves are busy helping me boil and mangle my underpants today, so I'm out of options."
"Is it a leap year again already?" asked Stephen.
"Aye,"
said the captain, his jaw set with steely determination. Just then, "Land ho!" came the cry from the crow's nest, and suddenly the bustling skyport of Mount Finger Peak appeared through the white wall of the mountaintop mists.
"Looks like we'd better get a move on."
Sputum turned to Fat Stephen, grinning cruelly.
"Unless you need to eat a roast dinner or something first."
But then Captain Mast Chris pierced Sputum's septum with his fork hand and murmured,
"No fannying about, shipmate. Just bring me treats."
The Angry Maiden made port, and once the bleeding from Sputum's nose had subsided, he and Fat Stephen trotted down the gangplank to the harbour.
"At least I can't smell them boiling pants anymore,"
muttered Sputum. The harbour market was alive with sky folk and mountain dwellers hawking maritime equipment, exotic foods, alcohols for drinking, and alcohols for stripping the paint off hulls, which were the same alcohols. Just as Fat Stephen was drinking in all these intoxicating new sights and smells, and wondering if it were possible to eat an entire market at once, and whether he'd still be able to outrun the constables once he had, Sputum brought his peg foot down hard on Stephen's flesh one. With Stephen frozen completely solid in the typical anticipation of the dawning of extreme pain, Sputum jammed his tusk up against Stephen's nose.
"Captain says we're to get pigs for roasting and rum for getting roasted, and if we bugger it up, we'll be for the chop. So pay attention, fatty."
At this, the pain in Stephen's foot finally penetrated the thick gauze of shock, and Stephen screamed so loudly that it killed a nearby cat. Then, the first wave of pain easing off, he scowled at Sputum and sulked potently. "I can think of worse things than the chop," Why don't you go get the supplies and leave me alone? Sputum was taken aback by this unusually petulant attitude. His trademark tusky scowl softened.
Why now, Fat Stephen? What swam up your urethra then?
Stephen couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was the first time that Sputum had ever asked him a question that didn't end, or do I have to kick your teeth in for you first? He scanned Sputum's inquisitive face, but found no trace of malice. I don't know if I want to sail with Captain Mast Chris any more. I don't like the rough-and-tumble crew, or the back-breaking work, or the total lack of any sort of payment, and I don't even like punishing bad children. I don't see the value of it. Fat Stephen felt much better for venting his unspeakable thoughts, but the feeling was brief. He looked back over to Sputum to see the inquisitive look replaced by one of utter contempt. Crack! Sputum's hand came down hard on Stephen's apple cheek, nearly knocking his face off his skull.
You pissy little wimp!
Spat Sputum.
You're even lilier-livered than I thinked you was! Don't see the value of brutalising nasty children? Pah!
Sputum ran out of words for a moment, so great was the hatred flowing out of him, and he gritted his teeth and squeezed out a very small fart instead. Then speech returned to him.
You disgust me! I'm going to fix you good! You won't just get the chop, you'll be dreaming of the chop! The chop will be like an arse massage compared to what I'm...
Then suddenly Sputum went quiet. All the fiery red went out of his green face, and a sickly smile returned to his thin lips.
But what am I getting all upset about when it's Mast Chris night tonight? Tell you what...
Sputum slapped Fat Stephen on his broad back.
If you want some time alone, you take care of the rum and I'll go get the pork. Division of labour.
Stephen eyed Sputum suspiciously, still rubbing his tingling cheek. All right, Sputum. Whatever you like. Stephen ambled off, furtively glancing back at Sputum as he went, towards a stall festooned with hefty ceramic jugs labelled "Side effects may include instant blindness, psychopathy, and intense rectal bleeding." Chuckling darkly to himself, Sputum sought out the new pork markets, which had been opened up the previous December by Screaming Lizzie, the mountain's resident syphilitic maniac. There he headed straight to the stall which sold winged airborne pigs. Unlike Fat Stephen, this was not Sputum's first time at market, and he knew that the flying pig's meat would fare much better at the ship's high altitude. Beside the cage, wherein the confused porkers flitted around, bouncing their snouts off the walls, stood a small, snotty little boy, arms folded, sneering at the world.
Oi, you boy!
Shouted Sputum.
Can you sell me 20 of them things? Who wants to know?
Sneered the boy. Sputum jutted his tusk out at the lad.
Listen here, you little shit. It's Mast Chris Eve, and I need 20 big hogs to feed the crew of the Angry Maiden, or my arse is stained glass.
Angry Maiden? The boy interjected.
Do you work for Captain Mast Chris?
Sputum rolled his eyes.
Yes, no autographs, I'm busy.
I hate that pirate, the boy declared. Last year, I got a really ace wooden toy horse for Christmas, and then, on Mast Chris night, you lot broke in and took it off me. The boy rubbed his fist angrily. That horse was perfect for bashing my little brother in the head. You could get really good purchase if you grabbed it by the hind legs. Sputum examined the horrid little creep before him, and an idea began to form in his crusty little brain.
What's your name, lad?
He asked. Biffy Spode, if you must know, the boy replied.
You really hate the captain, eh, Biffy?
Sputum asked. Yeah, the boy said, then performed an elaborate mime which appeared to indicate taking a corkscrew to someone's perineum.
Well then,
Sputum leaned in, or rather leaned sort of upwards because being an elf he was only around 2 feet tall and the boy was at least twice that.
How would you like to earn yourself a few extra doubloons and get your own back at the captain at the same time?
The boy's eyes widened. Biffy like! Once the flying pigs in the medical-grade rum were safely stowed back in the Angry Maiden's hold, it was time to weigh anchor. The captain bit the cork out of a jug and hoisted it high.
To your health, lads, he roared, and to another festive night of carnage.
The captain threw back the inaugural glug of faintly hissing rum, the crew cheered their tiny heads off, and the Angry Maiden set sail once again. They made first for Paraguay, as they did every year, because it has the most shitty kids per capita of any of the world's nations. Teddy bears were pilfered, train sets suffered catastrophic signal failures, and several houses were burnt down. By the time the ship had travelled as far up the continent as Nova Scotia, the sea shanties were rivalling the cries for blood, and the spirit of the raid was out in full force. The rum supplies on deck, by contrast, were severely depleted.
Mr. Sputum, called the captain, bring up another few gallons of bowel boiler. I know, just the lad, the elf, for the job,
replied Sputum. Once the captain's attentions were turned back to cross-referencing his thrice-checked list of awful children with the directory listings, Sputum sidled up to one of the crew. But there was something different about this elf. He wore his tricorn hat pulled down low, his ears were distinctly unpointy, and he was twice as tall as everybody else.
Now's the moment, Biffy, Sputum hissed up at him. Remember, just open the bay doors and throw it all out, and don't forget to leave the calling card.
You can always bet on Biffy, said the disguised Biffy in a cringeworthily smug drawl. He then tried to wink, but he messed it up and just blinked in an oddly pointed way and stole off to the hold.
What a dick, observed Sputum.
Close by, half-heartedly attempting to join in with the revelry of the raid, Fat Stephen stood lumpily. Sputum, fighting hard to suppress a wicked grin and adopt an expression of comradely concern, ummed at Fat Stephen.
Oh my gosh, Fat Stephen, something is very wrong here.
Stephen replied flatly, If you're going to pull my shorts down in front of everyone again, just get it over with.
No, my good shipmate, you misunderstand me. I am merely very concerned for your well-being. I can see you're not wearing your cloud boots, and gosharoo, what a dangerous omission at this altitude.
Fat Stephen felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Oh, no, I'm not wearing my cloud boots. I should go put them on. Before he had even finished the sentence, Sputum was ushering him over to the ladder down to the crew's quarters.
Yes, you had better go back to your cabin quick and get them, or who knows what will happen.
I will, thanks, Sputum, said Stephen, still thinking hard as he descended the ladder. He was distracted, though, because as he climbed down, he could have sworn he heard the sound of distant squealing pigs. About 20 minutes later, somewhere over Gabon, just as Captain Mast Chris was at the shaking, cold sweats and indiscriminate violence stage of rum withdrawal, Fat Stephen leapt back up onto the deck and barreled over to Sputum. I worked out what was bothering me, Sputum, you rotter. Sputum, smiling like a crocodile trying to sell someone insurance, replied,
Why, pray tell, whatever can you mean?
There's no such thing as cloud boots, said Stephen.
Oh, what a foolish error to have made, Fat Stephen. My sincerest apologies.
Pelican plops, rebutted Stephen. And where's the rest of the rum? I'm thirsty from searching my cabin top to bottom for made-up boots. Sputum's smile spread even more tightly over his enormous tusk.
Why, the captain sent Runkles down to chase up that other boy, elf. He should be back at any moment.
And back he indeed was. For at that very moment, Runkles burst out of the hatch to the hold and cried,
Treachery!
The crew stopped in their tracks, even the conga line, and they turned to listen.
The supplies! They're all gone! Someone's had them!
Disgusted gasps and oaths filled the air, and the captain charged to the front of the crowd.
Not the rum, surely! Not all of it! Captain Daddy needs his medicine!
It's all gone, Captain!
Gibbered Runkles.
All the supplies, and not just the food and drink neither. The replacement mop heads for swabbing, the oil for oiling up the wheel, and even the navigator's parrot.
At this, Ammonia the navigator let out a wailing cry that rang across the deck.
Not my little Gobby,
she sobbed.
Who's responsible for this? Roared the captain. Were there any clues?
Well, just this,
said Runkles, taking two objects from out of his belt.
A really massive spoon, and this bib that says, Kiss me, I'm Fat Stephen on it.
11.5 seconds later, Fat Stephen was lashed to the very top of the mainmast, sweating bullets and staring daggers at Sputum. I'm telling you, it wasn't me, he protested in a whiny way that even the most sympathetic soul would have to agree was quite grating.
Don't be pathetic, you greasy carbuncle, shouted the captain. You've acted like a right little tit and been a slave to your greedsome appetite, and now this is the only way that you can reclaim your honour.
Oh, said Stephen. How will I do that? Captain Mast Chris held his fork hand aloft and bellowed, By being lightning hauled! The elves cheered, fangs bared, baying for barbecued Stephen, for lightning hauling was the most horrible punishment practiced by skyfarers, wherein the condemned is strapped to a tall mast while the ship flies close under agitated thunderclouds, leaving them victim to hundreds of millions of volts of lightning. Fat Stephen began to quietly wet himself, even though he knew that moisture would only help conduct the electric currents more efficiently. But even as the captain was scanning the horizon for the nearest brooding cloud, Ammonia the navigator spotted something else through her telescope.
Pigs!
She called.
Off the starboard bow!
What? My pigs? Demanded the captain. The ship's entire crew that wasn't currently strapped to a mast raced over to starboard and craned to see. Sure enough, heading straight for the ship at high speed was the entire flock of winged pigs that had, until recently, occupied the hold. But that wasn't all. Riding the foremost pig in the phalanx was none other than the unusually tall elf crewman, now shod of his limp elf pirate disguise and revealed as Biffy Spode himself. He held his fist aloft and cried,
"This is for my little brother's unbashed head, Mast Chris, you penis!"
The flock made their first attack run at the ship. A strong hog split the bowsprit in twain with a single blow. Another crashed through the starboard hull like a cannonball and straight out the port. Still another came away with 3 elves kebabbed on one of its fangs, grunting happily. "Take up arms! Man the cannons!" The captain's unwavering voice pierced the panic, but the fear-stricken demon elves could only totter uselessly around the deck like bowling pins with little horns and really bad body odour. The rigging flailed loose, the sails billowed out, and the ship listed hard a starboard. All across the ship, demonic elves scrabbled helplessly at slick decking, grasping for purchase lest they topple clear off the angry maiden and make a high-speed improvised landing on Angola. The captain was not even touched by terror, however, and he drove his fork hand hard into the deck, staking himself in place. "I'll fillet that little ball bag," he vowed, and crawled fork over hand towards the ship's wheel. Up at the top of the mainmast, Fat Stephen watched all this with an overwhelming sense of dispassion. "Oh," he wondered to himself, "maybe we'll all die." But these defeatist thoughts were swept aside when he spotted the pig fleet dead ahead, coming about for another attack run. As the ship rolled further over, the Stephen-topped mainmast leaned straight into the path of the incoming hogs. As twitching snouts and snarling pig mouths bombed towards Fat Stephen, he had only one thought in his head. "Dinner!" Chomp! Fat Stephen clamped his mouth shut, and while 3 pigs had flown at the mainmast, only one made it past that point. The other 2 were chewed up and swallowed merrily by the delighted Stephen, who did a small burp and said, "Oh, gamey." Down on deck, scattered panic was replaced by static amazement as the captain and his crew came to terms with what they'd just witnessed, faces agog. After a moment, the captain roared, "Well, don't just stand there, you tiny little tossers! Man the rigging! Tie down that mainsail! Someone plug up that hole in the hull! We're taking on air!" The captain hauled at the wheel with all his might, and the ship began to right itself. As the damned elves found their footing, they found also that the fight was pummeled back into them by the captain's barked commands. Cries of "Aye, Captain!" peppered the deck, and some cheers even went up as the pointy little creatures gritted their teeth for an aeronautical scrap. Up on the mainmast, Stephen added, "And someone get me some mustard." Chomp! Another pig was snatched out of the air. Chomp! There went 3 more, in triangle formation, straight down Stephen's gullet. The ever-swelling elf chewed away happily, taking down whole hogs like Maltesers, the lighter way to enjoy chocolate. Down on deck, the captain gripped the wheel with his one non-fork hand and commanded his crew of unholy elf monstrosities as they patched up the pig damage and coordinated the counter-offensive. "Hard a port!" he yelled, and 100 clawed hands heaved at the ropes and brought the sails around. Aport the ship went, bearing down on 4 fleeing, screeching sky hogs. Chomp, chomp, and in 2 bites they were no more. A little way off, atop his hovering pig mount, horrible little tit Biffy Spode wailed and tore at his hair. "No! No! No, it wasn't supposed to go this way!" As he watched Fat Stephen swallow the penultimate and penultimate sky hogs, he dug his heels into the sole remaining attack pig on which he sat, and against its better judgment, it tore through the sky towards the ship. "I want my bashing horse back, Mast Chris!" Biffy screamed. This attracted the attention of the captain, who whipped around to see the pink tornado speeding right for him.
Hard a starboard! Look lively, lads!
The demon elves leapt to their work and the ship began to come about.
Taking her down! Dive!
Yelled the captain, yanking at the release lever and sending a jet of hot air out of the ballast balloons. The ship descended fast, and the pig bullet with Biffy on its back found its trajectory interrupted by the gaping maw of the hungriest elf of them all as the mainmast bore down.
"Oh, tits!"
screamed Biffy, and he kicked off the last surviving hog just as it began its journey down Fat Stephen's throat. Then he tumbled down through the air, and slammed straight into the deck of the Angry Maiden. With effort, he lifted his head and shook off the concussion. As his bleary vision came back into focus, he found himself surrounded on all sides by a horde of hardened elf skyfarers with less than jolly faces. Then Gobby the parrot flew out of his pocket and perched on Ammonia's shoulder, which of course made Ammonia very happy, so at least that was nice. Through the crowd marched the captain, his heavy boots coming down on the boards like cannon fire, parting the sea of angry elves.
Get Fat Stephen down from there,
he ordered the crew. Then he smiled wide, his golden tooth glinting in the moonlight.
It's time for his dessert.
Biffy squirmed.
"No! I admit it! I did it! I ejected all your supplies!"
The portion of the crew that wasn't groaning under the strain of winching Stephen down from the mainmast growled with rage.
"But it wasn't my idea!"
Biffy protested.
"It was Sputum! Him, there! He told me to do it!"
The hate-filled eyes of the elf crew turned to the first mate, who backed away, sweating like a stable boy in a convent's laundry room. The captain's face darkened, and he turned his laser-like glare towards Sputum.
Is this true?
He demanded.
Well, you see,
Sputum began a number of sentences, none of which had the power to save him. Fat Stephen, having arrived back at deck level, now more or less spherical and gently lolling back and forth, said,
Oh, Jesus Christ. Sputum, I knew you had it in for me, you blackguard.
Sputum scrabbled.
You know, a life at Skye can do funny things to an elf.
Then the captain pulled his legs off and threw him overboard into a volcano.
Now,
continued the captain,
what to do with little Biffy here? I think we ought to let Fat Stephen decide.
A roar of approval rose from the crew, but Stephen held up his hands, not an easy feat for an orb.
I'm sorry, Captain, but the truth is, I don't know if I'm cut out to be part of your crew. I don't know if I've got the stomach for all this corporal punishment. I can't hurt a child just for leading a pig attack on the ship.
Oh, ye must have still been up the mast for the first bit,
the captain reasoned.
Biffy here framed you for eating all the supplies and was going to let you be killed for it.
Fat Stephen was quiet for a moment, then screamed,
Lightning haul him!
And the whole crew cheered. Under a vicious lightning storm over western Mongolia, Fat Stephen was now deep into the sweatiest throes of a gale force meat hangover, breathing hard as even his formidable guts struggled to process the tonnage of pork he had consumed. Given pride of place beside the captain on the quarterdeck, Fat Stephen was tended to by the admiring crew. They constructed a comfortable bed around him from teddy bears and soft furnishings stolen from the world's inconstant children, and poured pillaged rum dregs down his throat, no matter how much he begged them to stop. They just slapped him on the round, distended place that had once been his back and said, Good lad, good lad. In a moment of respite, Stephen craned his neck around to speak to the captain at the wheel.
Captain, I may be exhausted and suffering from extreme abdominal pain, he said, but I'm sorry I ever doubted the value of punishing nasty children.
He looked up towards the top of the mainmast, which disappeared into a rumbling, flickering cloud bank.
I don't think I've ever seen anything more satisfying in my life, even more satisfying than a meal of 20 sky pigs.
Yo-ho-ho, that's my boy, said the captain. You just rest a while and enjoy the show.
Both buccaneers chuckled softly to themselves as Biffy's screams drifted down from the thunderclouds. They say that after Mast Chris was over, it was a full day before Fat Stephen could stand up again under his own strength. And that's why every 26th of June we celebrate Fat Stephen's rest. The end. Jolly Mast Chris listeners, and a very supine Fat Stephen's rest to you all.
The Legend of Fat Steven.
Everything you've just heard was made by me, Tom Crowley. Please submit all praise, questions or complaints to @atomcrowley on Twitter or email crowleytimepodcast@gmail.com. To support the show, go to patreon.com/crowleytime and become a supporter today. And there you can claim this episode's bonus material, an exclusive Fat Stevens Rest greeting card to send to your loved ones. Or you can go to crowleytime.com and buy some of this show's official merchandise. Now, all that's left to say is, Captain Mast Chris spare us, every one.